Okay, before we were cut off, we were just about to start this slide on fermentation. So I mentioned that fermentation is a way for organisms to oxidize the NADH to get the NAD plus back without needing the oxygen at the end of the electron transport chain to do it. So we're going to focus on two types of eukaryotic organisms that can do this. This fermentation process is what allows the glycolysis to continue. So instead of glycolysis just going once and then getting the pyruvate and that moving on to pyruvate oxidation, the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain, fermentation allows glycolysis to occur over and over and over again quite rapidly. So it's all about having a spot for the NADH molecule to transfer its H plus ions, not to processes or not to components of the electron transport chain. So in eukaryotes, it can be either ethanol fermentation or lactic acid fermentation. So we'll focus on ethanol fermentation first. In this process, pyruvate is broken down to carbon dioxide and acetaldehyde. So you're taking a 3-carbon molecule and you're removing that carbon dioxide to make it a 2-carbon molecule, the acetaldehyde. Then the NADH transfers as hydrogen atoms, so it's passing electrons along with the protons to acetaldehyde, and that will form ethanol. And in that way, the NADH has been oxidized to NAD+, and then that can go back to glycolysis so it can continue. It's yeast cells that we'll focus on that can perform ethanol fermentation. I believe there are some other organisms as well, but the main one that is used is yeast cells. And really that's the process of making wine and beer and other alcohols, drinkable alcohols. You take wine, for example, and it's grapes that are being fermented by the yeast cells. The yeast is using the grapes as a fuel to do alcohol fermentation, and that would produce the wine. In beer, it's barleys and malts. In vodka, for example, it's potatoes that are being fermented. In rum, it's sugarcane that is being fermented. So take a food source and ferment it, and you can basically produce an alcohol. Obviously, we know that this is a big industry, the alcohol beverages industry, but ethanol can also be used for energy. So some of our gasoline is supplemented with ethanol. Here's a flow chart that explains alcohol fermentation, ethanol fermentation, and yeast. So I would know this. I would put a star next to this slide. Glucose converted to 2-pyruvate in glycolysis, that produces the 2-ATP. That also reduces an NAD plus to NADH, 2 of them. And now glycolysis would stop unless it gets NAD plus back. So what ethanol fermentation does is it takes those pyruvates, it removes the CO2. So notice that CO2 gas is produced, which you would view as bubbles if you were viewing this type of reaction. And then there's your 2-acetaldehyde, which then accepts the electrons and protons from the NADH to become ethanol. And that is what regenerates the NAD+. So that glycolysis can occur again. So it becomes a cycle over and over and over again. So that glycolysis can continue in the yeast cell. Humans and other animals, we do not use ethanol fermentation as a way to produce energy. There are times when we are exercising where you are working so hard that you're not getting enough oxygen to your muscle cells to meet the demands that the muscle cells are giving. So in that case, it's not like you're there's no oxygen in the environment. It's just that you cannot deliver it. You don't have the cardiovascular system strong enough to deliver it to the muscles. So they got to find a way, those muscle cells, in order to continue working, at least for a short period of time, they got to find a way to regenerate the NAD plus as well. But it wouldn't be ethanol fermentation. Otherwise, if you exercise, you'd basically be producing ethanol and you'd be walking around drunk. So it's a different process called lactic acid fermentation. So in this case, there's no removal of a CO2 group. There's no formation of acetaldehyde. The NADH is going to transfer its hydrogen atoms directly to pyruvate after glycolysis is done. And that will oxidize the NADH and regenerate the NAD plus that's needed for glycolysis to continue. So now the person who's doing this vigorous exercise can do glycolysis over and over and over again quite rapidly and produce enough ATP to sustain this physical level, at least for a while. And the reason why it's only for a while is because that lactic acid that's produced will build up. It's going to decrease the pH of the blood. This is going to cause stiffness, soreness, and fatigue. So there's only so long you can do this strenuous exercise. And once that exercise stops, the lactic acid is going to go into the bloodstream, it's going to be taken up by your resting cells, and it's going to be converted back into pyruvate so that you can go back to your regular aerobic respiration. And so we mentioned muscle cells in humans as examples of cells that can do this process, but there are other organisms that can do it as well, like bacteria, and that has been utilized in the production of yogurt. So here's a flow chart showing lactic acid fermentation. Lactic acid is the same thing in the muscle cells. So you should note the differences with this flow chart compared to the one for ethanol fermentation. You got glucose going to pyruvate, same thing, but now there's no intermediate product here with the removal of CO2. So no CO2 is produced in lactic acid fermentation. The NADH is going to be oxidized to NAD plus because it's passing its hydrogen atoms to pyruvate directly to make lactate. There's a few slides about exercise physiology at the end of this. So if you think about it, when you're doing your exercise and you're doing anaerobic respiration, you're going to get this excess of lactic acid produced. You need extra oxygen to break that down. You can't keep that lactic acid in your bloodstream. It has to be removed. You can't let it accumulate in the muscles as well. It has to be removed. So it is converted, it's broken down into CO2 and water, but extra oxygen is required to do that. And that amount of extra oxygen is called oxygen debt. So that's why when you're done exercising, you breathe so heavily for a while, because you're trying to get that extra oxygen to help break down the lactic acid. A measure of how fit you are is your recovery time. One person might recover much quicker than another person. That person would be deemed more fit. And also, if you are more fit, then you're better able to do aerobic respiration, which means you're better able to deliver oxygen to your muscle cells. So you don't have to go into lactic acid fermentation as early as someone who's not fit. So you'll have less of an oxygen debt to pay off because you would have produced less lactic acid if you are aerobically fit. I mean, that's why we work out. That's why we do cardio at the gym, right? So that you can improve your cardiovascular system, the way that it delivers oxygen to your muscle cells, by making your heart stronger so it pumps more oxygen more efficiently, to make your lung capacity greater so that it can hold more oxygen and deliver it to your muscle cells. Now, we already mentioned the buildup of the lactic acid causes fatigue, but what superior athletes will do is they'll train by a method called interval training, and that will build up very big lactic acid loads. So let's say interval training, that could mean I work out really, really hard one day, take a day off, then work out really, really hard another day, then take a day off. Or it could even mean within a workout that I push myself really hard for 30 seconds, and then I go slow on the elliptical for a minute and a half, and then I push myself hard again, and I go slow. That will build up these big lactic acid loads. And what will happen is your body will respond to that. Your cells recognize that there's an increased demand for energy. So the cells will increase the number of mitochondria. Remember that mitochondria can divide on its own. So it can self-replicate. So you have a cell that has 50 mitochondria, and now all of a sudden you're doing this type of training, it can improve to get 100 mitochondria. It also improves how well the mitochondria functions. And this will allow the human body, the person who's training this way, to clear the lactic acid a lot more efficiently. This slide, you can see the contrast between an Olympic sprinter and an Olympic marathon runner. Obviously, the Olympic sprinter, this is a power exercise for less than 10 seconds. Usain Bolt is sprinting as fast as he possibly can. So he would be in anaerobic respiration because it can go a lot faster because you're just doing glycolysis over